From the Columbia University Language Resource Center, this is Said and Done, the podcast about languages and the people who speak them. This is Said and Done. I'm Chris Kaiser, and joining me today is Felice Beneduce, lecturer of Italian at Columbia University. In our conversation, we discuss growing up in an Italian family in Providence, Rhode Island, and speaking standard Italian at home. We talk about how his love for the Italian language has figured prominently throughout his life, from his time serving in the Italian army, to living in northern Italy, to studying Italian literature, and now to passing this knowledge on to his students and his family as a teacher of the language. Here's my conversation with Felice Beneduce. Professor Felice Beneduce, thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate you coming and speaking with us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
My pleasure. So let's get started and talk a little bit about growing up and the languages that you spoke growing up and the sort of linguistic environment that you lived in when you were a kid and growing up.
Of course. I was born in Providence, Rhode Island. I was the only child of an immigrant couple. And my mother, at the time of my birth, spoke no English whatsoever. My father spoke, but he always spoke to me in Italian. So my first language from birth until about 4 or 5 was Italian. I would speak English with my cousins when they came over, but since I was an only child, I didn't have any interactions in the home in English. And I really started to learn English when I went to kindergarten at 5.
And when you went to kindergarten and encountered English for the first time, can you talk about that experience? Like the first day, what you thought, or what it felt like?
My mother, that first day, I remember it very distinctly. My mother took me to the school and we didn't know where the entrance was. And as was so often the case when I was growing up, I was the interpreter. So I had to ask kids who were in the playground, where's the entrance? Because my mother couldn't ask because she couldn't speak English.
Right, yeah.
So then we found the right answer. And my interactions at the beginning were a bit, I was a bit put off by the other children in kindergarten, for the only reason that I didn't understand that they didn't understand how I had grown up, that I was bilingual. But that went away quickly. I mean, after the first few weeks.
Before you went to school, did you have exposure to English?
I had exposure to English passively. I would watch television, I would watch cartoons. If someone came to the house, the postman, hi, how are you, things of that nature. But it wasn't always an active usage of the language. So that I lacked when I went to kindergarten.
As you were moving throughout school, how did your sense of identity as a person who speaks English and Italian kind of develop? How did you think of yourself in that regard?
I considered myself normal, and the normality for me was the bilingual, where at one point my parents would speak to me in Italian, and then at another point my friends would speak to me in English, and I never saw it as anything special, anything that warranted any particular attention. I was very conscious of my ethnicity because my father instilled in me the traditions of our family, the traditions of our region, which is Abruzzo in central Italy. And my father instilled in me also the need to speak Italian at all times in the home. It was sort of, I was leading a dual life.
Right.
So there was a linguistic life at home and a linguistic life at school.
Why do you think your father was so insistent that you maintain a strong connection to your Italian identity and the Italian language?
Well, my father, there was a two-pronged approach, I believe. My father was, first of all, very, very attached to his country, to his village. And he also wanted me to learn standard Italian. This was fundamental for him because he didn't want me to learn dialect. It was much more important for him for me to learn the standard Italian so I could interact with other Italians. And that's often not the case in Italian-American society. When children of immigrants or grandchildren of immigrants have to communicate with Italians, often they'll revert back to dialect, whatever dialect their parents or their grandparents spoke. And my father didn't want that for me. He was very insistent on this.
I think that's really quite a unique thing,
Very,
actually.
very.
I know many Italian Americans
Mhm.
who have some exposure to the language, but
Mhm.
it's really the dialect or the local language.
Mhm.
So, did you have also exposure to the dialect, or was
Oh,
it
absolutely.
totally
No, no.
excluded?
My father, although my father insisted that I speak Italian,
Hmm.
he spoke dialect with his brothers and sisters. My mother spoke dialect with her sisters, so I was exposed to it constantly. I loved it because it was sort of a secret language, and I love to pick things up. I love to learn things in dialect. My father, however, didn't want me speaking. If he wanted me to avoid using dialect as much as possible. He
Yeah.
would actually buy children's books in Italian and have me read them in Italian, so I would learn the proper way to pronounce, the proper way to spell in Italian. But dialect was always present also
Yeah.
in my family.
Would you say then that you really grew up in a trilingual household?
From that point of view, definitely, most assuredly.
So, how did you distinguish between standard Italian and dialect in your own mind? How did were they was it a strong
It was
division?
it was it was a long process. No, at first it was they were all intermingled because the same people were using both languages with me. It was a long process for me that began more in adolescence when I started studying Italian at high school, and I actually started using what my father had insisted I learn, and that created the third rail, if we will,
Yeah.
of language, and that continued after my graduation from high school, when I moved back to Italy with my parents, and I realized that I could not interact with other people in dialect, and I had to. It was a sort of sink or swim situation.
Yeah.
I had to use the standard Italian that my father had taught me, that I had learned in high school, in order to engage with other people.
So you grew up in Providence, Rhode
Hmm.
Island, and you did your full schooling all the way through high school
Yes,
in
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 Providence.
in Providence in the U.S.
Exactly.
And then you moved with your family back to Italy. Can you
Exactly.
talk about that? Sort of what precipitated that, how you felt as you were doing
Well,
that?
the in many instances, the dream of the immigrant is to return
Mm.
to his or her own village, and that was my father's dream and my mother's dream also. Again, they had instilled within me a very, very strong sense of ethnic identity. So for me, it was as if I were moving to another state. It wasn't a difficult decision. There was a bit of a culture shock because I had realized after a few months that I didn't know as much about Italy or Italian as I thought I did. So that was a learning process. There was a learning curve there, and it took a while. Again, interacting with other people, serving in the military. I was drafted once I went
Wow.
back. So that was an yes, that was an experience, and it was up north. It was actually a great experience because it was up north, and that forced me out of the bubble of the village, and that forced my Italian to improve markedly.
Okay, so I have a couple of questions
Sure.
here. The first is, before you went back to Italy as you were growing up, did you go to Italy during
Oh
your
yes,
childhood? Okay, so you
absolutely.
were in contact with it.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes,
So it
yes.
wasn't just an imagined thing that then randomly one day became real. It
Well,
was
it was both.
okay.
There was the real contact with Italy, but there was also this mythos of Italy,
Uh-huh.
of the lifestyle of in the mountains, in the village, a romanticized version, so to speak, of my parents' youth, of my grandparents, of all of my family in the area. So there were two of that, both of them. But I would go back to Italy very often as a child, and meet my relatives there, and had friends there. But the amount of time I spent in Italy
Hmm.
wasn't enough to really learn about Italy. That I only learned after I was 18.
Gotcha. Okay. So then you said you were drafted into the military.
Yes.
It's a compulsory military service, or
At
it was at
at the
that time.
time, and in we're talking 1987, it was compulsory, and I was drafted. I actually volunteered. I volunteered to serve, and this goes back to the concept of my father, and what he had instilled in me. I volunteered to serve in the same corps that he had served
Mm.
in during the war.
Wow.
And yet I was 19. I was 19 when I was drafted.
And can were you scared when you were going to do this? What were your thoughts as you
The
were entering that experience?
first few days, yes, were a bit traumatic. Once you've gotten into the swing of boot camp, so to speak,
Uh-huh.
it became more and more normal. And then I was lucky enough to be assigned to a corps, battalion, I should say, excuse me, that participated in NATO exercises. So my job in the army was to be an interpreter
Oh, okay.
between Italian officers and American officers or Norwegian officers or whatever the case may be. So I found that experience very, very exhilarating. And it informed me to the point that after I got out of the army and I actually enrolled in an interpreting and translating school. I
Oh,
was
wow.
accepted, yes,
Yeah,
at
yeah.
the University of Trieste.
Oh, cool. You know, Trieste is such an interesting city.
Beautiful.
It's beautiful. To me, it's really its own thing because it's one foot in the east and one foot in the west.
Exactly.
It's really just kind of
Exactly.
a melting pot of
hmm
different things.
hmm
So, how long did you live in Trieste?
I moved to Trieste in November of 1989, and I moved away from Trieste in I think it was June of 1998.
Oh, so you really lived there for a
Yes.
while.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So I spent a good chunk of my 20s there.
Wow.
It was and as you said, it's a beautiful city. It has one of the most beautiful piazzas I've ever seen.
For sure.
Piazza Unita, I love it, and it is that melting pot of Eastern influence, Italian influence, and Austrian influence because the
hmm
Habsburgs were there. It was the only port of the Habsburgs, so there's a very, very strong Austrian imprint, especially on the architecture and on the grid, the city grid.
So at this point, talking about your 20s, it seems to me like you've had a really unique set of
Yes,
experiences in the
yes.
sense that you you had in one sense you had a standard Italian American experience and that you
Mm-hmm.
had exposure to the home country and
Mm-hmm.
a sense of importance. But to me, as I'm listening to you tell this story,
Mm-hmm.
the crucial component that is different is your father's insistence that you learn standard Italian
Absolutely.
and that you use that as a kind of passport
Yes,
to
absolutely.
modern Italy.
Absolutely. I mean, to this day, I believe that I am here teaching at Columbia because, as a consequence of my father's insistence.
Yeah, yeah.
Because if he had not insisted, I may never have gone down that path, or the path that I went down. So I'm very grateful to what he taught me, or his insistence to teach me
Yeah.
standard Italian so many years ago. But yes, it was a passport for me. Absolutely, absolutely.
So as you're living in Trieste
hmm
in your mid 20s
hmm
or late 20s, at that point, to what extent, how would you describe your identity at that point? Would you be seen and considered as just Italian or Italian American or something else? How?
it's funny. I've been told that I'm perfectly bilingual, so Native Italians can't distinguish that I'm not Native Italian.
hmm
Um, so I was able to insert myself very easily into the environment, the university environment. But I also began to rediscover my Italian Americanness, which is sort of odd. When I was in the United States and I was growing up as an Italian American, I felt more the Italian part of my being. As I went to university, I rediscovered the Italian American part,
Yeah.
the journey of the immigrant, the experiences of the immigrant abroad. Also, because my wife is the child of immigrants. Also, so she was born and raised in Germany. My in-laws immigrated there in the 1950s. So the immigrant experience became very, very important, increasingly more important to me as years went by. Therefore, when I came back to the United States and I decided to begin a life in academia, one of the fields that I wanted to study was Italian American Studies. That led me into Italian American Studies.
Mm-hmm. When did you come back to the United States?
We moved here in July of the year 2000.
And you went and studied Italian literature, is that
Yes,
right?
I
Okay.
was accepted in. So first of all, I taught for a year at Providence College. I taught Italian, and then I was accepted into the PhD program at the University of Connecticut, the Italian program. I was there for many years, and in the meantime, my wife was teaching Italian also as an adjunct. And that also was a wonderful experience for me. Returning back, rediscovering the love for literature, rediscovering the love of for figures that I had studied but I hadn't appreciated fully. Dante, for example. I discovered for the first time the author on whom I wrote my dissertation, was Primo Levi.
Mm.
A wonderful, wonderful author, incredible author. And so that was also a very, very enriching experience for me. And it was, as you know, I mean, being a TA is a hectic lifestyle.
Sure.
But it was all, I had met a lot of wonderful people. One of my best friends with whom I'm still very much in contact. And it formed me, that, and it led me also. It was another part of my journey towards Colombia,
Yeah.
for which I'm very, very grateful.
Yeah. So you said you wrote about Primo Levi.
Yes.
And for those listeners who might not know, could you tell us who is Primo Levi?
Primo Levi is the voice of the Shoah in Italy. He wrote an incredible account of his life at Auschwitz. In Italian is Sequestro un uomo, and in English, I believe it's Survival in Auschwitz. He described his experiences at Auschwitz. And he was a little, dare I say, denigrated by Italian establishment. This was part of my dissertation also. Italians love to consider themselves according to a myth, which in Italian is Italiani brava gente, which translated means Italians are good people.
Yeah.
We didn't participate in the Shoah. Those were the Germans. We helped and we saved many Jews, which is true. However, that's sort of brushing under the carpet the active participation that there had been amongst the fascists in favor of the Germans and the deportations of Italian Jews to the concentration camps. Primo Levi himself was betrayed by an Italian to the Germans. So he was the voice of all of those Italian Jews who had experienced the deportations, who had experienced the Shoah, who had experienced the Holocaust. And in my opinion, he is the most eloquent of writers. There are other writers, certainly, who wrote about Italian Jewish authors who wrote about the Shoah, but his voice is the preeminent, in my opinion.
You know, it's funny, Primo Levi was another person who had kind of multiple identities within himself.
Most definitely.
He was also a person who undertook a great journey, too.
Exactly.
So what aspect of Primo Levi's work did you focus in on, and did you find any personal relation to that as well?
Absolutely. Well, my focus was on Primo Levi's short stories of the fantastic. He wrote a series of science fiction and fantastic stories. And I loved the way he could frame his stories, express his stories. And I loved his style, even though many Italians didn't. Because he came from a background of being a scientist, he had a very, very linear, non-flowery style.
Yeah.
And that style really, really struck me, as opposed to other authors of a more classical formation. I also connected with Levi on a personal level because Levi, in 1938, when Italy passed the racial laws, the anti-Semitic laws, discovered that his Italianness wasn't as solid as he had thought it had been. And that same journey occurred with me when I moved back to Italy. So I saw a parallel, not that I ever endured anything close to what Levi endured, but that being forced to reevaluate what you thought was commonplace, was just a given, that connected me to Levi on a very, very deep level.
Right. You know, I've done some reading of Primo Levi, and my impression, and you can tell me if you agree, is that he really kind of combines a almost clinical scientific description with a connection to the storehouse of symbols and meanings contained within Italian culture.
Exactly.
You know, he connects it
Absolutely.
to Dante, to Ulysses. He's able
Absolutely.
to make these humanistic
Yes,
connections.
most definitely. There's one episode where he tries to explain Dante to a fellow inmate, and it's a wonderful piece. It's a beautiful passage where he tries to explain the importance of Dante. Um, but at the same time, he does have that clinical view
Yeah.
that you mentioned, which is so precise and so scientific. There's no other way I can explain it. That sometimes you don't read in accounts that come out of the Shoah.
And I think, you know, his first book, which you mentioned, Sequestro un Uomo,
Mm-hmm.
that came out right after the
Yes,
Holocaust.
exactly.
And I think that at that point, just describing what happened
Mm-hmm.
was pretty important because it was
Absolutely.
not well known.
Absolutely. It's still not well known.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, that part of Italian history and that part of Italian literature with Primo Levi hasn't been emphasized, in my opinion, enough in Italy. So there are many who know Primo Levi, who have heard of Primo Levi, but not a lot of people who know Primo Levi's experiences.
Right, right. So you wrote a dissertation on
Mm-hmm.
Primo Levi, and now you're back in the United States.
Yes.
So again, I want to kind of ask that same question that I
Sure.
asked earlier. You know, how are you thinking of yourself in terms of your Italian identity, your Italian American identity?
Mm-hmm.
How is that coalescing in this different context?
They have coalesced, the two, Italian American and Italian. They have become two halves of the same sphere, so to speak. And I've realized that I've been given a gift, a very precious gift, and I think it's my obligation to transmit this gift that I've been given to others, and hence my passion for teaching, my decision to enter into teaching, so I can teach my students of the worlds that I've lived through. And I always try to incorporate both Italian and Italian American
Yeah.
into my lessons.
You know, I think sometimes within the pedagogical world of Italian teaching, there's a kind of underappreciation of the Italian American experience.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And so how do you reevaluate that experience and transmit it in a positive light?
For example, I had my students recently read a poem by Lawrence Ferlinghetti, Old Italians Dying, but we read it in Italian.
Mm-hmm.
And it's an important piece because I use it as a bridge between the Italian Americans came here and who lived here and how they were dying, and their children were growing up more Americanized and perhaps, as we were speaking before, less attached to their Italian heritage. And then in the second part, I'm going into new Italians, so Italians of second generation, meaning children of immigrants to Italy, and I find that it's a wonderful. So I can teach my students what Italians were having come here,
Yeah.
what their experiences were living here, and how Italy has changed in the 21st century.
You used a word that's actually kind of it's a meaningful word, new Italians. Can you talk about what that is?
Of course, new Italians, in my opinion, my definition of the term, are those Italians, those young men and women who were either born in Italy or were brought to Italy at an early age and have been formed in Italy, but are children of immigrants, be they from China, from Romania, from Albania, whatever the case may be. And they are Italians 150%. Now, unfortunately, I have to include something from politics,
Sure.
from the upcoming elections. There are political parties who don't believe this is true, who consider Italianness as something of blood rather than something of upbringing. And that's something that I try to teach my students is not true, because of these young men and women, again, who are formed completely in Italy, go to school in Italy, speak Italian, and they are Italian at 150%. So denying their Italianness is just an absurdity.
Yeah. You know, one of the prevalent ideas in Italy is the idea of jus sanguinis.
Yes, exactly. Good. That's it.
birthright or
Yes.
blood right,
Yes, yes, yes.
versus jus soli,
Solis, exactly.
which is the right that you acquire by being born in a certain place. And I always found it curious that as a descendant of Italians, even though I had a very tangential relationship with Italy until I was going to college, I had the blood right to
Yes.
become an Italian citizen.
Exactly.
And I would meet people in Italy who were, as you said, 150% Italian, but they didn't have the blood
Exactly.
right. And so they could not bureaucratically become Italian.
Exactly.
Whereas I could. And I found that,
Exactly.
as an American, I found that crazy.
It's jarring. There are many, okay, starting from your experience, there are many South Americans who have acquired Italian citizenship, even though they may be at 4 generations from Italy. And it's made easy for them because of the law of jus sanguinis. Then they may never come to Italy, or they may go to Spain or to France or used to go to Great Britain when England was part of the EU, or Germany, whatever the case may be. Instead, in Italy, what they have now is jus soli 18, according to which a child of immigrants born and raised in Italy, again, I cannot emphasize this enough, at 18 must request citizenship. And I always found that jarring, because it's as if they had to beg to be granted what they should have had from birth.
And what they already are.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. They have, in order to make official their identity, they have to ask for it when they're 18. And the point of requesting the citizenship is that it can be denied.
Right.
There are cases in which it is denied. So these children, these Italians, are left without a real country, because if they were to return to their parents' country, they wouldn't be able to speak the language probably. They wouldn't know the culture. And I always found this very, very, very unfair. Fortunately, now they're talking about a third approach, which is jus scholae, which would grant citizenship to a student, to an Italian adolescent or child also, who had completed 5 years of a cycle of school. So as long as they have completed 5 years of school in Italy, they could apply for, and their parents were in good standing. That's a part of the of the law. They could apply for citizenship.
Yeah.
So things are progressing in Italy, but again, I hate to insert politics into our conversation, but there are political forces today in Italy who want to deny this journey of these young Italians.
Talking about birthright, talking about jus sanguinis, jus soli, irrespective of where we are born, we all have a history.
Exactly.
We all come from somewhere. And I think many people have found a certain sense of meaning in tracing out the path
Yes.
that the ancestors have taken that bring you to where you are.
Exactly.
And I know that you have found very meaningful the kind of discovery that goes along with researching the family line that you come
most
from.
definitely.
So could you talk about how you became interested in that and what it has meant to you?
Sure. I actually became interested in genealogy at a very early age, 15 or 16. Unfortunately, the resources at my disposal weren't so good, so I had to base myself on the memory of the elder members of my family, but I had a fairly good idea of my ancestors for, I'd say, 2 or 3 generations back. I kept up my interest in genealogy throughout the years, until I discovered, and here is where genealogy really came to the fore for me personally, an online website where I could go through the birth and death certificates of the people born in my father's village and my mother's village, and that really, I started going through these registers, birth registers, death registers, marriage registers, and I created a fairly extensive family tree going back 400 years.
Oh, wow.
So my son can trace his ancestors back 10 generations. And I realize for many people that this isn't very important, but in my eyes, it gives my son a depth, a knowledge of his family that goes back so far and in so many generations that can only help him, can only enrich him,
Yeah.
understand what, and help him understand, and help me understand also what we are, how we've become what we've become, how we have gotten to this point. Because my journey is only a part of my ancestors' journey. And we start from these peasants in the mountains of Abruzzo who survive pestilence and drought and famine and come through it on the other end, so that their ancestors could come to a land that they had never heard of, that they could never spell because they were illiterate, and make a life for themselves. I also love discovering little tidbits of personality. My name is Beneduce. The last name Beneduce, was a name given to orphans and to bastards. So the first person on my family tree, the one who was born in 1636, was the son of a woman, and we don't know his father's name.
Mm.
So you in genealogy, you get the good, the bad, and the ugly. If you'll pardon me the cinematic pun. So, but it's interesting because it brings it down to earth. A lot of people get into genealogy expecting to find King Arthur,
Right.
or Charlemagne, or Federico Barbarossa. Instead, I appreciate the peasant, the hardiness of the peasant, the consistency of the peasant. I've discovered, for example, that my fifth great grandfather, when he got married, the village elders and the parish priest sung his praises, and they wrote them down.
Really?
Yes, they wrote this wonderful paragraph saying how he was a very industrious young man, and his marriage to my fifth great grandmother would be advantageous to her, because in his industriousness, he would be able to keep her well, and to keep their family well.
From what you're saying, you discover a little glimpse, a little flash
exactly
of a person.
Exactly.
And from that, you engage in an act of the imagination.
Yes.
Because you imagine, this was a whole life. This was a whole lifespan.
Mm-hmm.
I see just this tiny glimmer of that, and I can imagine what this person must have been like.
Yes, that's perfectly said. Yes. What type of person he was, what type of man he was. Contrarily, his father, my sixth great grandfather, was a bit of a hothead.
Okay.
And he was actually expelled from his village.
Wow.
He was expelled, the year was 1814. And my theory is, I've never found this for sure, but with certainty, I haven't ever proved this. But my theory is that he was a sustainer of the Bonaparte family.
Mm.
And he had become a sort of big wheel in the village, and he had used his influence unduly. And once the Bonapartes fell, he was forced to leave the village with his family.
So your family was, until your parents' generation, always in this village?
There are actually two villages. As the crow flies, they may be 4 miles away from each other.
And what are they called?
The village where my father was born is called Giuliopoli. The village where my ancestors came from is called Pescopenataro. They are very, very close. They administratively, they're in two different regions. Giuliopoli is in Abruzzo. Pescopenataro is in Molise. But again, on the map, they're very, very, very close. And again, my ancestor from Pescopenataro was forced to leave with his family to go to Giuliopoli because of probably his association with the Bonaparte regime.
Wow. That's so cool.
It is. I mean, again, the bad. You learn the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Yeah. And so now, your family continues. That story continues.
Mm-hmm.
So can we talk for a moment about your family today?
Sure.
And, you mentioned that in your household, you speak mostly Italian.
Mostly Italian. So my wife and I speak Italian almost exclusively to each other, unless there's something bureaucratic that we have to say to that doesn't convey. Um, we speak in Italian to our son,
Yeah.
who is 10 years old. He understands 100% of what we're saying to him. He answers us a good portion of the time, but as any child, he tends to veer towards the language of the place. So he'll answer many times. He'll answer us in English. Very often, we'll insist that he answer in Italian, so he learns. So he may learn to answer in Italian. I'd like to instill into my son the same respect for the language that my father instilled into me.
Yeah. How does that play out? How do you take what your father did for you, and how do you do that in reciprocally, or how do you do that in return for your own son?
Well, we're both soccer fans, my son and I. So
Okay.
we watch the games of Serie A, and I try to comment with him in Italian on the games. He learns how to pronounce the names of the teams in Italian. I have to say, he also has a very strong sense of his ethnic identity.
Mm.
He is very proud of his background. He will say, "I am Italian." Many times he will say, "I'm not American, I'm Italian," and we'll have to explain to him that he's a bit of both.
Yeah.
But I see in him that same passion for Italy that my father instilled in me, and
Yeah.
I'm very happy that it's there. He's been there many times. The first time he traveled, he was 2 months old.
Oh wow. Yeah.
So he loves Italy. He loves his family there. He loves being there. He loves the experience. And unfortunately, between COVID and the recent war, we have not been able to return for 3 years. So
Right.
he's a little bit upset about that. But
Yeah.
hopefully
Missing it.
next summer we'll be able to go.
Oh, that's great. So the story continues.
It will. It definitely continues. It absolutely continues.
Well, Felice, thank you for coming by,
Thank you,
having
Chris.
this
Thank you
conversation
so
with
much
me.
for having me.
I really appreciated it.
I appreciate it too. Thank you.